Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our virtual alumni panel discussion featuring some superb representatives from the McAnulty College of Liberal Arts. I'm Sarah Speary, the AVP of Alumni Engagement, and I'll be serving as the moderator today as our panel discusses the timely topic of contested landscapes, discussing race, space, and memory. I'll be filling in for Dr. Chapdelaine, who had a last-minute commitment arise that couldn't be moved. But before we get started with today's program, I have a few housekeeping items to review. First, I'd like to thank Audrey Tierney, Associate Director of Alumni Engagement, for helping with the arrangements for this program and for managing the technology during the panel. Throughout the presentation, your microphones will be muted, but you are welcome to submit questions through the chat feature found on the toolbar on the bottom of the screen. We'll try to address as many questions as we can during the hour-long program, starting with those that were pre-submitted. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists, then turn the program over to Calvin to set the stage for our discussion. I'm pleased to introduce McAnulty College of Liberal Arts faculty member, Dr. Jennifer Taylor, Assistant Professor of Public History. Jennifer is responsible for launching an oral and digital history lab housed in Duquesne's History Department and the McAnulty College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts. At Duquesne, she serves on the university's Oral History Advisory Board and collaborates with Duquesne's Oral History Initiative led by Gumberg Library's Archival Department. In spring 2021, they launched 2 new oral history projects on COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement. Her current work traces the rebirth of the Woodrow Wilson family home as the first museum of Reconstruction in the nation. She uses the home and docent oral histories as a lens to analyze inclusivity, white supremacy, and contested history in museums and public spaces. She recently completed a series of podcasts for the city of Pittsburgh on public art and its relationship with local communities for inclusion on the city's GIS map of these memorials. The GIS project is believed to be the first of its kind on city public art. Her most recent public art project is a co-authored article exploring the removal of Giuseppe Moretti's Stephen Foster statue in Pittsburgh and the contentious current debate surrounding the removal of Frank Vitor's Columbus statue. Jennifer has worked closely with our next panelist, her former student, Amanda Syme. Amanda is a museum professional with a Master's of Arts from Duquesne's Public History program. She's currently the program coordinator for Compass Inn Museum and Ligonier Valley Historical Society, where she presents history to audiences outside of the classroom through a range of educational programs. Ms. Syme is also interested in public memory and the visible layers of history in the built environment. During her time at Duquesne, she developed a historical walking tour of Pittsburgh's East Liberty neighborhood. She is currently co-authoring an article with Dr. Taylor about the 2018 removal of Pittsburgh's Stephen Foster Monument. Also with us today is alumna Megan Toomer. Megan graduated from Duquesne with her BA in Political Science and African Studies with a minor in Psychology. While at Duquesne, Megan studied abroad in Ghana, Africa, completing 2 courses including pre-colonial African history and African religions, and visited several historical sites including Elmina Dungeon, Cape Coast Dungeon, and Asan Manso. Upon her return, Megan and Dr. Robin Chapdelaine co-authored an article titled Experiential Learning in Ghana's Dungeons, an exploration of how identity shapes study abroad experiences. Also during her time at Duquesne, Megan worked alongside Pittsburgh's minority groups through several local organizations. Megan is currently attending Emory University School of Law and is pursuing a career as a civil rights attorney. In her career, Megan hopes to create spaces for minorities in law who are often underrepresented. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Calvin Parnell Jr. Calvin is a current doctoral candidate at the University of Virginia, specializing in race, identity, and materiality in 19th and 20th century American art, modern sculpture and sculptural history, and 18th and 19th century transatlantic visual culture under the direction of Sarah Betzner. He graduated cum laude from Duquesne, where he earned his bachelor's degree in history and art history and received the Giorgio Vasari Award for Excellence in Art History. In 2018, Calvin finished his qualifying paper entitled Lasting Legibility, an examination of fiction and authorship in Selma Burke's The Four Freedoms, which examines the negotiations of patronage and authorship between artists and the federal government in New Deal art production. In 2019, Kelvin reached candidacy and is currently working on his dissertation titled Casting Bronze, Recasting Race, Sculpture in Mid to Late 19th Century America. His project explores race and sculptural theories to examine the intersections of race, bronze material, and statuary in constructing Native and African American identities in the 19th century through the works of sculptors Henry Kirk Brown and John Quincy Adams Ward. In 2021, Kelvin will complete a year-long pre-doctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian American Art Museum as a Wyeth Foundation Fellow. I'm really excited to take part in this conversation today. Kelvin, I'll let you set the stage for our discussion.
All right, thank you to Sarah and Audrey and the panelists for being here with me. I will share my screen here. First, I just want to say that it's great to be back at Duquesne, even though it's virtual. I hope to get back there soon once everyone is vaccinated and everyone is safe and healthy. So I want to thank my panelists for being here, sharing their expertise on this issue and this matter of race, space, and memory. I want to thank Audrey and Sarah for being so instrumental in putting this program and other programs at the university together. What they're doing is wonderful and exciting and important work, and they are very thoughtful individuals. So if you all have a chance, I encourage you to extend some thanks to them as well once this is over. And finally, I want to thank the history department at Duquesne that gave me my start. And although the faculty has changed some since I've been here, I know that there is still the rigorous training and values are still central to the department. And I will be forever grateful for their opportunities they provided for me. So today I'm going to share some images and Sarah talk about sculpture, particularly two sculptures in Charlottesville, to get at this question about race, space, and memory. Now we'll begin. Over the past 5 years, sculpture has occupied a prominent position within our social discourse as our nation has turned its attention to works of art that hail and elevate men, and I deploy that gender deliberately, who have aided in the genocide of this continent's native populations, men who have enslaved generations upon generations of Africans and those of African descent, and men who took up arms against this country to maintain the vile institution of slavery and establish a hierarchical society whose cornerstone is white supremacy. In response, swaths of citizens around the country and around the world have in many cases petitioned their local, state, and federal governments to remove these works, and in other cases, taken it upon themselves to remedy the problem at hand through iconoclasm or the destruction or defacement of art for political, religious, or ideological reasons. As a result, one common refrain that I wish to focus on for the purpose of this keynote is the question of, if we destroy these works or even remove them, are we not destroying history? In part, for those engaging in good faith, I understand from where that line of questioning comes. Monuments and memorials in the form of figurative sculpture have always been a part of our lives. They appear to give us a windows into the past by marking time, displaying iconic historic figures we think we know from our history books, and they give us physical manifestation to our historic memories. Yet, I urge caution when thinking about these monuments under those circumstances, especially regarding memory, because memory is very complicated, and therefore we should complicate our approach and interpretation of works of art that attempt to embody and preserve memory. The preeminent Civil War historian David Blight tells us that, quote, the study of historical memory might be defined, therefore, as the study of cultural struggle, of contested truths, interpretations, moments, events, epics, rituals, or even text in history that thresh out rival versions of the past that are in turn put into the service of the present, end quote. As other historians have noted as well, quote, whenever memory is invoked, we should be asking by whom, where, in which context, and against what, end quote. I want us to hold these questions together as I move through this presentation and we move through our discussion. For those who decry the bouts of and calls for iconoclasm in the past for years, I want to make clear that this nation's relationship to sculpture began not with the creation of one, but instead the destruction of one in the pursuit to replace that statue with one that best fit the burgeoning country's understanding of itself, who it was, and who it wanted to be. In 1770, the first statue in the North American colonies was created and erected in New York City, an equestrian statue to King George III, the first villain in the story of America. Cast in lead and gilded gold, this sculpture's grandeur and opulence did not go unnoticed. It stood on a marble pedestal and displayed a larger than life size young King George III, rested atop a large stallion and cloaked in Roman drapery with a truncheon in his hand and a laurel wreath on his head. The English king's right arm formed a classical adlocutio gesture, a symbol of imperial power and a suggestion of an imminent address from a monarch to his subjects, modeled after the famed ancient Roman statue to Marcus Aurelius. It functioned as a constant memory, not history, to the American colonists of power, person, and ideology, which they rejected and reminded them of their continued subjugation by Great Britain and their tethered connection to the old world. But you probably have never heard of this statue because it only lasted 6 years before American revolutionaries in 1776 broke in and climbed over the fencing installed to protect the sculpture. They strung a rope around its neck and pulled it down, crashing to the ground as it collapsed onto itself, while patriots began to cheer in adulation while kicking and stomping on its remains. This came after the statue endured months of protests, graffiti, and vandalism. In many ways, it was one of the first casualties of the American Revolution, and its replacement was, to a man many believe bore responsibility for inciting the events that led to the statue's destruction. A son of liberty and pronounced patriarch of a new nation formed out of rebellion. If you were paying close attention to the news in 2017, the scene I just described, which happened over 240 years ago, may sound familiar to the iconoclasm of a Confederate monument in Durham, North Carolina on August 14th in 2017. If you did not see this story, however, I understand. You were probably, like me, still reeling from the horrific news involving another Confederate monument, which shares many commonalities with the King George statue. 170 miles north of Durham, in a place that I've called home for the last 5 years in Charlottesville, Virginia. On August 11th and 12th, 2017, Charlottesville became enraptured in fear and delved into violence as white supremacists descended upon the city. Over those 2 days, our city and its citizens bore witness to tiki torch wielding white men in khakis as they marched on one of the nation's preeminent public universities and surrounded a statue of one of the country's founders, Thomas Jefferson, while university students huddled together in fear as the mob chanting, quote, "Jews will not replace us," end quote, closed in. We saw, excuse me, we saw the sight of Coast Guard tanks and men wielding Nazi flags and high-capacity rifles as they roamed the streets in the background. We smelled the pungent scent of tear gas and heard the screams of our friends and neighbors as a white supremacist drove his car into a crowd of people, injuring dozens and killing a young social justice activist named Heather Heyer. I'd yet to begin my second year of graduate school when these events occurred and was still a novice regarding the study of sculpture. And I found myself questioning why and what was this all for? All for a statue seemed confusing at the time. I myself am not a Southerner, or at least I'm not a Southerner from Old Dixie. So it took some time for me to fully wrap my head around it. But then I saw these two images and I began to analyze them. Those white nationalists that came to Charlottesville with anger in their hearts and violence in their spirits were there answering a call to arms issued to defend and protect what seemed to be an imminent threat to a monument of a man on horseback that seemed as if his statue would soon face the same fate as King George's statue. They came to ensure that the monument continued to perform a service which many have relied on since its creation almost 100 years ago, a service which many continue to rely on today. And ultimately, this protection was granted. Here we have agents of the state clad in riot gear, charged not with the protection of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, but instead to protect that which is lifeless, to protect an amalgam of copper, zinc, and tin, while citizens were brutalized in parking garages or having their wounds tended to on street corners, to protect a mere piece of metal and property whose visage represents a man whose idea of property lay not solely in the material, but also in the flesh. But a question still remained: why this statue and why Charlottesville? In this work and many works like it, we can see a concrete example of where looking into its past helps us understand its present, because the two are quite entangled. From its inception, the Robert E. Lee Monument in Charlottesville had been commissioned and designed to perform a version of surveillance in a similar fashion to the King George III statue, surveilled American colonists, drawing similar ire. However, in this case, Lee performs a version of racial surveillance and serves as a reminder to the city's white and black residents of the Old South and its presence in the present. The sculpture was one part of a four-part venture of public statuary for the city of Charlottesville. Here on the left, we have the Lee statue. On the right, we have the Stonewall Jackson statue. And on the left here, we have the George Rogers Clark statue. And then on the right, we have the Lewis and Clark statue. While I would love to speak about all of them, I will focus on the two that have a strong connection to the man who commissioned and funded all four sculptures. The son of a former slave owner, University of Virginia graduate, and white supremacist philanthropist Paul Goodloe McIntyre. In 1917, McIntyre began his efforts to install monuments to slaveholders and Confederate generals Thomas Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, with the goal of raising from the dead the bodily forms of his ideological ancestors, to enshrine them in what they stood for in a state of near permanence. That permanence not only relied on the statues themselves, but also their environments. While McIntyre's investment was in sculpture, it was also in space, white space, in the maintenance of white space. This becomes clearer when we examine the dedication ceremonies of these sculptures and see that their installments were but one part of a multifaceted effort to engender white-only spaces, if not legally, then socially, as well as have them stand as nodes of white power. McIntyre purchased large swaths of land for the purpose of raising these monuments in the forms of Jackson Park and Lee Park, designed to be communal, whites-only spaces in segregated parks. On October 19th, 1921, during a Confederate reunion, the Thomas Stonewall Jackson Monument, as well as Jackson Park, were dedicated with thunderous applause and fanfare from the thousands of people in attendance. Jackson, who during his time was largely thought of as no standout amongst his fellow soldiers, had slowly over the decades since the Civil War been turned into a mythic-like figure. After the 1861 Battle of Manassas, where he earned his moniker Stonewall, and later the Battle of Chancellorsville, where he lost his right arm due to friendly fire from his own men, killing him 8 days later, Jackson became a myth within Southern culture and a martyr for the Confederate cause. His myth became elevated and more substantiated in this equestrian monument, because that is effectually the purpose of works like this. It leaves no room for critical assessment of his life or the wretched cause for which he fought. In fact, Jackson is almost reanimated in this form, the bronze statue giving life to inert matter as he sits astride his horse, both lurching forward in an action pose, as if they are still surging through the battlefield. In this way, Jackson's memory becomes an alive one, even more so made real by the presence of his great-great-granddaughter, Anna Jackson Preston, in the crowd at the dedication, who was charged with unveiling the work to the city of Charlottesville. In this moment, the vestige of the Old South was reinvigorated and passed on to a new generation, an heirloom for them to keep and maintain, to pass down to their own children and their children's children. Further, this statue played a pivotal role in reinvigorating the area's local Ku Klux Klan presence. Resurrected by D.W. Griffith's 1915 film Birth of a Nation, the Klan organized two chapters in the city of Charlottesville, one of them being at the University of Virginia. They also advertised the summer leading up to the Jackson unveiling that, quote, the Ku Klux Klan organized here, end quote, and also issued a warning to the city that, quote, law and order should prevail, end quote, and for all, quote unquote, undesirables to leave the city. These acts, with the statue unveiling, ensured that Charlottesville remained a predominantly white space, and so it has been for the last 100 years. Only a quick walk away from the Jackson Monument, on May 21st, 1924, the Lee statue was dedicated in Lee Park. Draped in a Confederate flag, while white Charlottesvillians onlookers awaited in anticipation for the unveiling of their very own monument to Robert E. Lee, a feat their neighbors in Richmond had achieved some 30 years prior. Standing 26 feet tall, Lee sits on his horse Traveler. In contrast with the Jackson Monument, he is still and resolute as is his horse, who was depicted in a downward look, evidently modeled after the Richmond Monument, which heavily resembles the arrangement of the George Washington monument you saw earlier. The Lee statue's dedication, like the Jackson one, was steeped in lost cause ideology and evocations of white supremacy. Similar to the Jackson dedication, the ceremony ensured that there would be some familial connection to Lee, once again bridging the generational and memory gap between the Old South and the new one. Although she was only 3 years old, Lee's great granddaughter, Mary Walker Lee, as best as a 3-year-old could, unveiled the statue to the crowd, which was met with a bevy of boisterous applause as men wearing the Northern Army of Virginia saluted their long gone commander. Additionally, the dedication of the Lee statue in 1924 coincided with two significant moments in Virginia's racial history. 3 months before the ceremony, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, a law which prevented interracial marriage and ensured racial segregation in home ownership by preventing people from living in neighborhoods where they were prevented from marrying any member of the majority population. In simple terms, this law was used to create homeowners associations with racist covenants with banks refusing to sell homes to Black residents in white neighborhoods. The same covenants were used in Richmond because of their Lee statue and their infamous Monument Avenue to ensure that the boulevard remained a white-only space. Further, the same year of the Lee dedication coincided with the 1924 reunion of the Grand Camp of Confederate Veterans of Virginia, a week-long festival of Old Dixie pride. The local Klan organization, Klan Number 9, celebrated the reunion and incoming statue with the burning of a cross on Mont Alto, a mountain named by Thomas Jefferson, and marches through Charlottesville cloaked and concealed in white robes and white hoods as citizens lined the streets to welcome them, ending the parade at the Black neighborhood in Vinegar Hill. The specters of these men continue to haunt the Black Charlottesvillians as they did in the early 20th century, when many were only a generation or two removed from slavery, and for some were enslaved themselves to people like McIntyre's father or Thomas Jefferson in his Monticello estate. Amidst the backdrop for the dedication of both these monuments were demands by the city's local Black residents not to erect the statues, but also calls for racial equality and equity in the face of the oppressive and legal racial apartheid levied onto them by Jim Crow. Black residents and community leaders alike called for the end of racist policies barring them from public goods, service, and public spaces, as well as barring them from education. Those calls were met with vitriol. The Daily Progress, Charlottesville's preeminent local newspaper, issued an editorial responding to the residents calling their complaints, quote, absurd tirades and impossible proposals, end quote, and told the Black Charlottesville community that, quote, the Negro should remember their place, end quote. When we think about monuments in memory, conveniently, these individuals' memories are never accounted for. Thus, these works are indeed not about history, but instead about memory and power, and the use of both to attempt to obscure history, to deny it. Their dedications ensured that the lost cause prevailed and thrived into the 20th and 21st centuries in perpetuity. These works aid in the warping purpose, goals, and even outcomes of the Civil War by the Confederacy, enshroud its pro-slavery crusade in the cloak of states' rights and honorable men fighting against economic tyranny from Northern aggressors. Men high on horseback and held for their military achievement, even when their record did not merit such admiration. Yet they are allowed to slip almost seamlessly into a category of mere war veterans, for which we owe our deference as our national culture commands of us. They then become just Southern military men who represent a particular culture in a particular time, of which those who are from the South should be prideful, instead of treating them like the rebellious traitors they were, who merit no reverence nor admiration because their cause and their deaths were not noble nor valorous. From the moment of their dedications to now, these works stand ominously in the background with watchful eye. They bear witness to acts of racist aggression. They give and continue to give license to their ideological descendants to take up their cause, and they call them to arms when their memory is in threat of being challenged. Here it bears necessity to remind everyone that these works were not intended or designed to reflect a particular set of historical facts, teach us lessons from the past, or even simply mourn the dead. These works enable admirers of these men and even Confederates and even of the Confederate cause to, quote, transcend the specifics of the war, end quote, to a point where, as Edwin Alderman, known eugenicist, white supremacist, and the first university president of the University of Virginia, said, quote, "To call it treason is to add viciousness to stupidity," end quote. The connections between these monuments and the events of their dedications with the tragic events of August 11th and 12th in Charlottesville cannot go unnoticed. When these sculptures faced perceived danger, it elicited an eerily similar yet unsurprising response from the ideological descendants of those celebrating the 1921 and 24 Confederate reunions. In a way, the threat of removal or destruction for these works engendered a new Confederate reunion, where in the last few years, the city of Charlottesville and its residents have been on high alert every August as white nationalists continue to attempt to gather in the city and reminisce about that 2017 summer. So in conclusion, in these monuments, we can see the most visible and forthright articulations of white supremacy in statuary. And further, we can see the most pointed examples of how monuments to these individuals both make whiteness and white supremacy invisible under the guise of heritage or history, while at the same time curating specifically white spaces. They combine power, identity, and memory into one entity and become quite useful, potent tools, which in most cases conceal our history. These monuments position these men as exemplars of virtue without alluding in any such way about their vices. This comes at a cost to all of us because it shields us from their true nature, from their true history, which in turn erases and makes invisible our collective history. So I'm here before you today to offer that no, history is not being destroyed or wiped away with the destruction, removal, and replacement of these objects, which have been used as tools of white supremacy to obscure truth and memory, uphold racist ideologies, perform racial surveillance, and curate spaces intended for a white majority. We cannot allow these statues and the spaces they dominate to assume a position of neutrality because, quote, space is not socially neutral, but rather is produced within and framed by social values, end quote. One of the ways in which we frame those values, and I've always framed those values in the United States, has been through the production, erection, and yes, even destruction of sculpture and statuary in the form of memorials and monuments. These objects and events inform what we as a society value. And it's time to ask ourselves if these individuals and what they stood for is what we want to continue to value, not only today, but for the foreseeable future. It is important that we both know how these tools have been constructed to uphold white supremacy in both the past and present. Only then can we have a discussion about how to deconstruct them in the ideology which they bolster. Through sculpture and the destruction of sculpture, Americans once again are vying for an opportunity to tell the story of who we were, who we are, and who we want to be in this experiment we call American democracy. Thank you.
Wow, Calvin, you have been living history since you arrived in Charlottesville. Thanks so much for setting the stage for our conversation today and for sharing those images and making us all remember the recent history, but also what has been brought up from the past. So we'll start by talking about some of the questions that we promised to the audience that we would address as part of your keynote, but also as part of the discussion. And just a note to the audience that we're going to make this as much of a conversation as we possibly can. And I'll just serve to ask some of the pre-submitted questions, but hope that this crew can kind of chat among each other. Let's start with talking about, who determines what gets remembered? Calvin was talking a little bit about statues from the 1700s and how they're remembered now, but can we talk about current history and who decides what's being remembered? Jennifer or Megan, can I ask you to start with that? I know you have some more recent experience with this.
Yeah, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit of an offshoot of what Kelvin's whole presentation was. That was fantastic, by the way.
Thanks.
But I think that who determines history now, how we're recounting history now, isn't much different than who was recounting history before. And I mean that in the way that history is very much socially constructed, which is what Kelvin's whole presentation was really talking about. And we see the events over the summer, people getting emboldened by that history, and these same people end up going on to be politicians. They are politicians, they're sitting presidents, and they're writing history right now, and that's what's happening. And so you end up getting the majority, which ends up being entrenched in white supremacy, writing our history. And unfortunately, I want to be optimistic and say that the events of over the summer and even now in the pandemic are going to be recounted in a way that is inclusive, where we talk about how these events have affected the most marginalized in our society. But the fact of the matter is that that typically doesn't happen. And I know it sounds really pessimistic, and I don't want it to be that way, but it's hard not to be when you're seeing all these things happen. You're seeing brutal murders over the summer, and people are still insisting that this is what happened. This is how we're going to recount this. This was people invoking violence, and it's just the narrative still hasn't really shifted where it needs to be, which is a place in which we can see where marginalized folks are coming from, why marginalized folks are taking the streets, why we're seeing that these Confederate monuments need to be deconstructed. It's just like that conversation's happening a little bit, but it's not happening the way it's supposed to. And I don't think it's happening enough in institutions of higher learning specifically.
Great. And we will actually touch upon that further on in the discussion. Anyone else want to talk a little bit about, that? Jennifer, you want to, or Amanda, sorry, would you speak to a second about what gets remembered?
Yes, I was just going to add to what I completely agree on, Megan and Kelvin. I would also add that it's partly about to the group it's about ownership of space, power and control over our surroundings. So with Kelvin's really great presentation, he was talking specifically about Confederate memorials and statues. And if we think about the time period when those were being constructed, that was a time period during Jim Crow when Southern whites had control over the physical landscape. They had the legal power to erect monuments and memorials to the individuals that they chose. So they had this power and control to physically change our surroundings in order to perpetuate their ideology of white supremacy. I would also add, though, that, I know we're talking specifically about public art and monuments, but we could also, even if we're talking about ownership of space and our physical surroundings influencing memories, we could also think about this in a much more broad way. Buildings, just our regular ordinary surroundings, buildings, streets, parks, all things that surround us, they're all physical evidence that affects what gets remembered. And so if we think about it in that way, it can even get into broad government systems like city planning, and even private systems like development corporations, mortgage lenders, those people who are determining who can live and work where. If I was going to give one just really quick example, would be redlining, that practice that started in the 1930s, where certain people, and specifically people of color, were denied access to loans to live in certain neighborhoods. So this practice of redlining promoted racially segregated neighborhoods, which its legacy is still being seen in our cities today. The way that our neighborhoods look today is deeply contested from our history. So if we're asking who determines what gets remembered, I would have to say it would also include broad public and private systems like that determines what our environment looks like.
Very true, and can lead into our next question. What do we do when we have our memories challenged, or those physical spaces are contested or challenged, to Kelvin's presentation? Jennifer, would you like to talk to that a little bit? Well, you have to unmute.
Struggle in my Zoom existence. Yeah, and actually this kind of ties into a little bit of what I think our alumni have been saying, which is while a lot of the voices are the same over the course of the last 150 years that have been building these monuments, I do think Black Lives Matter, and particularly George Floyd, moved us into a new period of conversation about these monuments. And so I think we're seeing more contested dissent made possible by actually the protesting that's taking shape. So for example, Kelvin has done a really wonderful job of talking about Charlottesville in 2017 and its impact. Well, here, Amanda and I have discovered that that is the moment that they decided to finally remove the Stephen Foster statue after years and years of debate. That becomes the impetus there. And one of the things that Amanda and I had talked about was just, Columbus seems too far away right now to talk about really removing it from the landscape. And then we had the death of George Floyd over the summer. And here in Pittsburgh, we immediately saw a renewed backlash to the Columbus Monument, to the point where now it is slated to be removed, but there is more contested debate about that because there has been lawsuits. I don't know where that's going to end up, but for the first time, we're really seeing conversations being acknowledged from Indigenous communities, from Black communities, from I think even abroad globally. We're seeing sort of this response to imperialism and colonization. They're chunking monuments into the sea. So there does seem to be a shift, but I don't think we yet know what that means in this modern moment.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead.
Sorry,
Kelvin.
go ahead.
I was just going to say we're seeing, because we have a little bit of space between the Charlottesville moment and now, we have time to reflect on that. So maybe in a few years, we'll be able to reflect more on what's happened last summer and be able to tie it to some of these memories that have been developed. Go ahead, Kelvin.
Yeah, I was going to say, the reason I said early in the presentation that memory is very complicated is because when we have our memories challenged, we respond in very visceral ways, because memories are very deeply connected to us. They kind of like help us, they help us mark time, find out where our place is in this world amongst our family and friends, environments, and things like that. So when memory is contested, people will respond in very visceral ways because they conflate memory with objective truth of something. The problem with that is, and which is why I study sculpture and statuary, when you put that part of your memory into a work like a Robert E. Lee statue or a Stonewall Jackson statue, now your memory that is very subjective, your memory is different from my memory. Now that is now demanding that you acknowledge that memory and respect that memory as well. And that's why we talk about contested landscapes, because these things are very fraught, and that's why I mentioned it for Black Charlottesvillians, their memory can't exist in that statue then. So because someone like McIntyre, who both of those statues in today's money would cost almost $1 million, because both of those, because that individual had the resources, the power, and the money to enshrine his own version of memory, other people had to live in it, live in that shadow, and could never have their own kind of memories put in place. That's the kind of danger of having these images around. I think from the George Floyd protests over the summer, there was a reason why statues became the kind of lightning rods for those protests, even though George Floyd has nothing to do with Columbus, or has nothing to do with necessarily Robert E. Lee or anything like that. But it's people are making the connections themselves, though. It's the landscape and the kind of ideology that is that kind of invades the American consciousness is allowed to continue as you have these objects that don't teach us anything. Trust me, I've spent a lot of times with sculptures and they don't talk to you, no matter how long you stay with them. They are not there to teach. They are not there to be didactic in that way. They are there for remembrance. They're there for reverence. That becomes a problem in a place like Charlottesville, where there's a contested about how we remember. I mean, there are still people here who are descendants of slaves that Thomas Jefferson owned. Them walking through those spaces, they are constantly having to then have their memories made for them. And I think that's what happens when we have our memories contested.
Jennifer, if you can unmute.
Just one small thing I wanted to add. I saw, I was looking at the posters that Kelvin shared for the Unite the Right rally. And if you look at the one on the left, there is the name Dr. Michael Hill at the bottom. I think it's important to remember how long white supremacists have been pushing back against these monuments that are contested by other communities. And he is actually the guy who coined the phrase heritage, not hate, that I think a lot of people imagine goes back to the 1960s, but that's something that was developed in the 1990s. So that's, and I think it was actually 1994. That's, they've been working on a narrative that this is not about, and it applies to the Confederate flag. This is not about white supremacy. This is a conversation about heritage. So there's been about 30 years building to this moment from these players that you're seeing on the ground in Charlottesville.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And it speaks to one of the questions that you guys have already answered. So I don't have to ask that about, what is contested and how do we understand what that means and display that. I'm going to change gears a little bit here to talk specifically a little bit about Duquesne and how Duquesne's curriculum maybe addresses these issues and what the awareness of our Duquesne students or young people are about environmental degradation and racism. Let's start with Megan on that, since you're our most recent graduate of Duquesne's program. Can you talk about maybe what our Duquesne students or youth are taught, and perhaps Jennifer, you might talk a little bit about the curriculum and maybe what they're learning at Duquesne. So go ahead, Megan.
So I'm from the liberal arts college, so I'm speaking very much from that angle. I will say, I don't think, like I said earlier, I alluded to it earlier, I don't think Duquesne nor most institutions of higher learning do a good job of this. What I immediately come to mind too is when I first started at Duquesne, we were told not to go to predominantly Black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And the implication there was that it was dangerous. It was inherently dangerous. And they were speaking to a majority white students population. So these students go throughout their entire careers believing that this historically Black population right up the street is just completely off limits for them because it's an inherently dangerous spot. And I kind of came head to head with this when I traveled abroad and I went to Ghana, going to Ansi Mansu, which is it's called a slave walk, but it's where slaves were marched through before they went on boats and they never came back. So it was just kind of like a walk of no return. We also went to Cape Coast Dungeon and Elmina Dungeon, and there you immediately saw how it was an in-your-face reflection of how little Duquesne does in this area, because so many students, in particular white students, could not believe that this was the severity of what had happened, that these were the roots of what was going on. And even when I was studying abroad, a lot of these highly contested issues that we were seeing in the news were happening still. And it was just a moment of complete, I don't know how to describe it. People were just completely off, they were taken off guard. They didn't know how to handle it. And it kind of speaks to the contested memories. It was like people were coming head to head with the fact that their ancestors had a play in this, and that they had to do something about it. But it becomes difficult because, like, what do you do now? You're sitting here and you're sitting in this dungeon, and what do you do from here? And that moment for me made it very clear that Duquesne's not doing enough, because that should not have been the first time that a lot of these students were made aware of the gruesome nature of what the slave trade was and the transatlantic slave trade was. And it becomes even more, I don't know how else to say other than upsetting, when you think about students being told time and time again to not interact with historically Black neighborhoods who were disproportionately affected by gentrification and redlining in Pittsburgh. This all connects. And I think it has to start in a lot of different places, but I wish that it could be in the classroom and we have these open discussions in the classroom. And that's not to say that all of my professors weren't like that. I had some amazing professors who disrupted the space in the classroom and wanted to talk about it. We're willing to make it a little uncomfortable so that we could have these discussions, but a lot of them were very unwilling, which is unfortunate.
Sorry, if I'm mute wouldn't come off. Well, I think to your point, they were getting the education, they were getting, their eyes open to something that maybe hadn't been done, for the 20 years prior. So it's exciting that they were able, I think, to receive that kind of firsthand experience by going abroad to see that. I guess, do we want to still talk any more about the Duquesne curriculum or the experience? Or I know we have a lot more questions and just under 15 minutes to go on. Anybody else want to add to that? Okay. Go ahead, Jennifer. No?
No, I was just going to say that, I think we're beginning to see some conversations on campus, but like Megan, there's more that can be done here. But I think with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and a lot of the work and the programming they're doing, it shouldn't fall all on them. But I think we are seeing better conversations. Granted, I've only been here 4 years, but as someone who did come from a Southern institution, seeing how these conversations differ versus a Southern school and a school like Duquesne has also been really interesting for me as I've transferred from region. So
bounce off of that too. I think that, yeah, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, I do want to say, does so much work. They're a big part of the reason why I felt very welcomed coming to Duquesne, because of that office in particular. But as you said, Jennifer, it's just, the onus can't be on them, because this is not their historical doing. So it has to be on, it would be nice to see it coming from administration, but also other professors too, other offices that exist on campus, because I know a big issue that a lot of Black students in particular at Duquesne had is that they never felt welcomed there. And so that's an issue of like, we're ignoring things going on in the classroom. People aren't talking about what needs to be said. There's national catastrophes happening and we're not addressing them correctly. So yeah, I think that now that I'm in the South and I'm seeing some of the conversations happening here, I think that the conversations happen a little more up north, but there's a lot of work to do, like you said, Jennifer.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Moving on to one of the other pre-submitted questions. We talked a little bit about removing these monuments to kind of make peace, perhaps. What's the psychological impact of removing monuments on the trust and respect of our history education? I know, Calvin, you talked about that in your remarks. Would you like to hit on that a little bit?
Yeah. I don't want to bore you with the art historical theory and all that stuff because it's complicated. But this is what happens when iconoclasm occurs. For one, iconoclasm is kind of central to being a human being. We see things, we like them up, and then we eventually don't like them up. So we get rid of them and we put new things up there. Essentially, what happens with iconoclasm is you do see a rupture, and you see kind of like a fracturing of time and space, something that like getting ripped out of the landscape, like a tree being rooted out. There is a need to kind of replace that thing in a similar fashion of what was taken away. And the reason I say that is because that King George statue that I began with, once that was removed and destroyed, there became an instant urge to replace it, because it is a part of the landscape, it is a part of our environment. And the replacement was that George Washington statue. So in that way, it's trying to contest memory, kind of like using, as some art historians saying, using the visual language of the oppressors to kind of turn it back on them. A lot of Black artists who worked in sculpture did the exact same things at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, trying to use that formation of white supremacy in sculpture and kind of flip it on its head and advocate for their own self-identification. So iconoclasm, it's going to be messy and it's going to be very, very uncomfortable for people. But I'm here to tell you that it will not stop. Iconoclasm will never stop in this kind of course of human history. It's kind of just what we naturally do. So we need to be prepared for like what versions those iconoclasms come in, and then what replaces them. Because as I said, power and influence is specifically in art is how things get made. So if something like a Robert E. Lee statue comes down, we do need to be very wary about what we replace it with, and that there will be a call for replacing that thing. One kind of remedy for that is the artist Kehinde Wiley. He's a brilliant, a grandmaster painter. Most people know him from his portrait paintings. He did the official portrait for former President Barack Obama, but he made a sculpture in 2019 that was an equestrian sculpture of with a Black rider on top of it. Equestrian sculptures are kind of these ancestors of the 19th and very early 20th century. So people wonder why he would do that. He's doing that same thing. He's taking that language, he modeled it after a Confederate monument and said, you know, we're going to disrupt and contest and take this person out. And then we're going to put new identification in there, because that's kind of how we have moved forward as a country. When we take something down, we need to have a new replacement that says that is not who we are, but this is who we want to be.
So go ahead, Amanda.
Yes, I completely agree. And I know I hear a lot when monuments come down and people are wanting to, their calls for replacing it. You get a lot of people saying that, oh, you're erasing history, or sometimes you hear that term revisionist history, and it's being used in a negative sense. But really, revisionist history is just very simply when new information comes to light, when new perspectives that have been overlooked before, have been omitted from the historical record before, when these are being brought up, we're getting a more full understanding of the big picture of what actually happened. And so a lot of times when people feel personally attacked because they're hearing these things that they've never heard before, and it feels like their personal beliefs are being attacked. So, but it's really just about new information is coming to light. And so I think that's also history education. I mean, that was the original question, was trust in respect for history education. If history education tells you that historical interpretations change over time with historiography, how history is written. And so with that full understanding of facts, interpretations have to be reevaluated.
So I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Calvin has a 1 o'clock commitment, and we told the attendees this would be an hour. I'm gonna ask the last question, and those of you who are on the panel can answer if you'd like. This question says that actions speak louder than words, and the subject of race in America has been talked about for decades. What action either do you have for those in the audience, or will you be taking on your own part to help speak louder than the words we're saying today? Megan, I know that you had said that was something you wanted to maybe talk about what you're planning on doing.
So my bio had mentioned this, but I do plan on going into civil rights law. A big part of the work I do plan on going into, though, is criminal justice reform. I think that, and this conversation is especially involved in that. I don't think that we can separate race relations in America and also not talk about criminal justice reform and what that looks like. So those are some of the concrete steps that I've been taking. But outside of that, and just being a student, I also dedicate my time to a lot of pro bono work. And I think that that's important, especially at Duquesne. I don't think that enough I don't know how many students are really going to be on this call, but I don't know how many students really get into the community and learn what these, what organizations are there. There's so many, and I get texts often about what organizations I can get involved in. What can I do? There's so many refugee communities in Pittsburgh that need help. There's so many kids that need help. Criminal justice reform is needed in Pittsburgh, unlike anywhere else I have seen. Incarceration there is just, Allegheny County Jail needs a whole lot of work. And so those are just concrete steps I can think of on the top of my head. And I think that sometimes these conversations seem so large and looming, and how do we get started? And I think one of the very concrete ways that you can get started is just get in your community, see what your community looks like. And I know that can be especially hard if you're not from Pittsburgh. I'm experiencing that now, trying to get used to Atlanta, but it's definitely possible. And just ask the right people. There's so many people that are willing to help. So.
Thanks for that. Anyone else want to answer that? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, on a local level, I would just like to encourage you. What I think Amanda and I have discovered doing local research on public art is we do have an art commission here. They do meet. They do listen to public voices, and you can always turn up or submit questions to them if you're having a conversation about some of our local public art and want to get to the bottom of it. Heinz History Center just did something on Columbus where they brought in filmmakers and talking about the Italian connections and what it meant to that community, but also how Columbus is problematic. So there's lots of resources on the local level. And I would be loath to tell you to put all your focus on the Confederacy as well. I'm going to do a quick screen share really quickly. But one of the first things I discovered, Megan was talking about being in Atlanta and trying to find things and what to do. But I wanted to show you guys this marker here. I think you guys can see. I know the lighting's bad, but this is outside of Fort Duquesne. It's commemorating Pittsburgh, and you will see here, this is erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And we had a question in the chat about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which did play a huge role in creating Confederate monuments. But you'll see here, this says, this is 1930 when this is erected, and that this opened up the Great West and established Anglo-Saxon supremacy. So this is not something that we're necessarily hiding. And just for those of you concerned that asked about the UDC, the SPLC has a great map here where they have pointed where all these monuments, when they were constructed to the Confederacy, and you can clearly see through this timeline that it is peak Jim Crow between 1900 and 1920 and the civil rights where they go up. So you can get involved with these organizations and study them, contribute, give your voice. And that goes a long way to letting the community know how you feel.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jennifer, for sharing. Calvin, I'll turn it over to you before you have to leave to wrap us up a little bit.
I'll speak briefly about the last question and then offer some conclusionary remarks. I would say at the simplest level, commit yourself to truth telling. And I say that because, people, as Amanda spoke to about people saying that it's, revisionist history. For one, all history is revisionist history. That is the point of a historian. If not, we wouldn't know anything. But I want to say that these, from my experience and expertise as an art historian, as I said, these works in themselves are not history tellers. They are history markers. And we need to ask questions of them of why they were put there and for what purpose. And going to what Jennifer just showed all of us, and none of it's hidden. Most of these things are right out in the open. The intent for those things are right out in the open. So question your community, get involved, organize, because, as I said, that poster, and if anyone watches the recording, take a pause on that poster, especially the right one, because the Unite the Right poster, you have this sculpture is a part of it, not just one sculpture. You can see in the silhouettes, and obviously people who aren't art historians, I can tell what all of those sculptures are. And they're not just to Confederates. One of them is the George Washington statue that I showed you. People are using them as these kind of lightning rods for ideology because in many ways that is their intended purpose. So, question the tactics people are using, why they're reminiscing on these things. So just in conclusion, I want to thank everyone on the panel for sharing all of their great expertise and experiences. And I want to say, the arts do matter. If they didn't, and this is a very kind of visceral thing to say, to end with as well. But if they didn't matter, a woman wouldn't have died in Charlottesville in 2017 over people being there for a statue. These things have lived presences in our own lives. And there's a need for empathy to be shared with, not just with the people who are saying maybe we should keep them up or maybe we shouldn't, we don't know what they're doing, but the people who have lived with them in their communities for all this time and have said constantly, we need to take them down. These things are not trends. This is not the new kind of, these things aren't hashtags on Twitter. People have been saying these things. That Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, the one in Richmond, since the day that it was put in, we have to take them down. We have to remove them. So keep those in mind and listen to the people who are saying that to you. They have no reason to lie when they're saying that they're affecting their communities, that they have plagued their communities the entire time. So more listening and more empathy for those individuals. And if you want history, please listen to the people who are on this panel. Don't look to your statues for history. As I said, they never talk back. So.
Thanks, Calvin. That was a good concluding remarks. And I think we probably could talk on this subject all afternoon. And I think our listeners would also just hang around. We're getting lots of really nice feedback in the chat. So thank you to all of our panelists for giving such insight into this topic. We hope everyone that participated today enjoyed the discussion and learned something along the way. Everyone that participated today in a follow-up email will receive a copy of the recording that you can refer to and share with others. Please do so. If you have any suggestions for future programs, you can email the alumni office and we will take those into consideration. As always, we hope you'll check out our full lineup of virtual programs at myduquesne.duq.edu. We hope you will continue to live the mission of Duquesne and everything that you do every day. And as always, go Dukes.
Go Dukes.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
See everyone.